of you who are just logging in, we are going to be virtual and talking to two of the country's leading experts on voting rights. That would not be me. I'm a moderator today. But I did want to mention, as I said to those who logged in early, that at the bottom of your screen you have a couple of options. There's a chat box if you want to say hello to everybody. Also there's a Q&A. So if you have questions for the panelists, we'll try to pay attention to those. And so pop questions in the queue, if you will. So with that, let me introduce very briefly. If I gave the full and appropriate introduction, it would take the full hour. So I'm going to say very briefly that welcome to our panelists and welcome to our members of the audience. Justin Levitt, who is a voting rights expert and somebody who's been worked in the Justice Department for some time. He also spent years prior to becoming a law professor protecting people's voting rights in some of the country's leading public interest organizations. So thanks for being here, Justin. Really appreciate your involvement. And Justin, I should note, is just coming off a term as a associate dean for faculty and scholars. So he's looking much happier and more relaxed now than he has in the last 3 years.
Isn't it 14 more days?
It is 14 more days. But I'm anticipating the world behind you, Jessica. It's that vision that I'm looking at.
And also Jessica Levinson, who's a clinical professor at Loyola. She's also director of the Public Service Institute at Loyola and associate director of the Journalist Law School, which is our boot camp in law for professional journalists. She has served as the president of the Los Angeles Ethics Commission, and perhaps most recently, she regularly has a weekly segment on KCRW and co-hosts another separate podcast on KCRW called the Legal Eagle Files, and she contributes regularly to NBC op-ed projects for their NBC Online program. So thank you both for being here. Welcome, and let's get started. As I mentioned, if you members of the audience have questions, you can pop them in the Q&A, which is a box at the bottom. We'll try to get to them. All three of us will be paying attention and we'll try to work it in. But let me start by asking Jessica. You know, here we are in a pandemic and people are scared to death of standing in line to vote. I don't like the thought of joining with 1,000 other people and going into small rooms with a lot of other people. And so there's been proposals to vote by mail, get everybody to vote by mail. So let's start with that. President Trump says it's a terrible idea. What do you think?
You really set me up for that one, John. President Trump says it's a terrible idea. What do you think? So first of all, let me just say, such fun to be here. I've been really looking forward to this. And I am with the actual expert, Justin Levitt, and I'm here to have some fun with all of you. So thank you for giving me the first one here, which is yes, you should feel very safe to vote by mail. And no, what the president has said about voting by mail is simply not true. Typically, I think as lawyers, as people who are civically engaged, we try and say, well, the president might indicate X, Y, Z. No, it is just not true. So let's pick up on what John said. It is pretty clear, I think, that COVID will be around during the election. There may be a spike, and polling places are just not ideal places to be when it comes to your health, safety, and welfare. So what's the alternative? It's what a lot of Americans already do. It's what every state allows some version of already, which is to vote by mail. Now, what does that mean? It means, and I think Justin's going to talk about more specifics, but it means that there's got to be a lot of ramp up on the front end. I mean, it means everything from, in some cases, like in California, potentially executive orders, to just making sure that we have the paper and the printers and the little chips in the envelopes if we're going to track ballots. I mean, it's really nuts and bolts time. And then on the back end, it means that we need the scanners, we need the machines we need the infrastructure in order to be able to process all these vote by mail ballots. Now, we hear a lot about this idea that there's some sort of systemic fraud, that we can't trust the system. And we have seen, and I'm sure Justin's going to talk about this, but I saw this chart last night with respect to voter registration, that it kind of goes like this for about a year, and then suddenly in March, it just goes like this. And so it's really important that people feel safe to register to vote and feel safe to actually vote. Justin did the final word on whether or not there's voter fraud, an exhaustive piece on this, and the answer is that it's extremely, extremely, extremely rare. When it occurs, is it slightly more likely to occur during the vote by mail process? Yes, but remember how many extremely's I put in front of that rare. So what are some options, and I'll just lay this out, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in more detail, but what are some options that we can think about? It's everything from what we're trying to do in California to just say, if you're a registered voter, you get a vote by mail ballot, to saying things like, normally we require an excuse if you want to vote by mail ballot, but in this case, either you don't require an excuse or just write COVID and we all get what you mean. It's doing things like making it easier to register to vote, and then what I'm sure we'll talk about, which is still allowing for some in-person option. So with that, I already talked way too long for the first question.
That's okay. Very informative. Let me pick up on this article that the world famous Justin Levitt has produced. And if you want to see how many citations there are, I did this once, maybe 2 years ago, and it was off the charts, cited by every publication on the planet, I thought. So Justin, tell us about how frequent do we as a society in the United States, we're not talking about Russia, we're not talking about ballot stuffing in some, countries, we're talking about the United States. How frequently have we seen voter fraud in the United States?
It happens every once in a while. And in most elections, there are a handful of cases of a handful of ballots that are miscount or miscast. Where somebody's casting either multiple ballots and shouldn't, or casting a ballot in the name of somebody else, or something like that. But it's really, as Jessica said, a vanishingly rare circumstance. The study that I did was focused on in-person voting, on the sort of voting that showing a photo ID at the polls can help safeguard, or ostensibly can help safeguard. And it found, back in 2014, it found about 31 credible instances, not prosecutions, credible instances, out of more than 1 billion with a B ballots cast over the course of 14 years. I've updated, we're now to about 45 credible instances out of quite a bit more than 1 billion ballots cast. So pretending to be somebody else at the polls is really vanishingly rare. Exactly as Jessica said, there are slightly more instances of absentee ballot fraud or misconduct in the absentee system. It used to be slightly more common still, but these are all multiple grains of sand that we're still counting. Federal law and state practices have actually cut down on the opportunities for fraud in any way that is systemic. When it's systemic, there was a notable incident a couple years ago in North Carolina that was discovered, that was prosecuted, and that resulted in a new election being held. So the ability to slip one by the officials is still really, really uncommon. And it gets dramatically harder to perpetuate fraud. The way the system is built, the larger the race. So in the vanishingly rare circumstances where we see it in the municipal race, we see it in a county judge race somewhere, we see it in a county commissioner race. We only have to change 5 or 10 or 100 ballots in order to think that you have a chance to win the election differently. It is really hard to steal a statewide race, and it's next to impossible to steal a presidential race by systematically committing fraud. The system is very safe. And that's part of the reason why people, including the president, have voted by mail for so long. Members of the military, as Jessica said, we've had this for a long time in every state. Members of the military and overseas citizens vote by mail. Many citizens who are over 65 vote by mail reliably. We'll get to some populations are hard to mail. So it's difficult to mail to Native American reservations. It can be difficult in some urban environments to make sure the mail gets where it needs to be at the right time at the right place. We still need some in-person options, but by and large, vast swaths of the country have used this system, and it works really reliably.
Great, great. Well, that's very informative. Just a reminder to everybody, and some people have just checked in, welcome at any time, to post a question in the Q&A, the little box at the bottom. If you click on it, there's a Q&A, and just pop your question in and we'll try to get to it. So let me follow up with both of you. So are there alternatives? Okay, so far we've talked about in-person voting on November 7th or some second Tuesday in November versus the possibility of everybody voting by mail or getting mail ballots. What are some alternatives to those two? Are there good alternatives?
So I'll start and then let Jessica follow up. There are plenty of alternatives on the spectrum, and in fact, every state is somewhere in between the two. There are very few states that even call themselves all vote by mail. 5 states have systems that are all vote by mail. I keep putting that in quotes because they have drop boxes where you can physically drop the ballot off even if you don't postally mail it. And there are some states that have very small percentages of absentee voting, but some individuals, most of the people go to vote in person. So that means every state somewhere in between. Some of the proposals being kicked around right now in states involve ways to encourage more absentee voting, as Jessica mentioned before, in a time of pandemic, to make sure that we save the in-person experiences for those who really need them and that they're safe to go to. And that encouragement can take a lot of different forms. You can, as several secretaries of state have already done, you can mail absentee ballot applications to every registered voter on the rolls. So we know you're registered. Would you like to apply to get an absentee ballot? Here's the application. You can go a step further and mail absentee ballots to every registered voter on the rolls, or just the active registered voters who showed up in a period of past elections. Those are ways to various points along the spectrum of encouraging absentee voting. But we're not really talking about 100% at one pole or the other, ever.
So even the states, and there are 5. I didn't realize there were that many. There are 5 states.
There are more that are joining. So they are, I think I'm going to get this right. Washington, and Jessica's going to correct me, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Hawaii, I believe. You'll notice that those tend to be mountain western states, and that's with some reason. There are states along the western coast and in the mountain range that have been more comfortable with absentee balloting for a while. And those 5 states made the move, some quite recently. Oregon's been doing this for a very long time. Washington's slightly less long. The other states relatively recently. There are some states that have moved in that direction to make it, quote unquote, all vote by mail. That has a big impact in municipal elections. Turnout goes through the roof in municipal elections. But it's really just a different means of engaging the same voters or similar voters for things like a presidential election in November. Now it turns out it's going to be pretty important in a pandemic time.
So we have a question: how likely is the Postal Service to be able to handle the vote by mail burden, especially in view of congressional efforts to tamp down, to ride herd on the U.S. Postal Service? Is that going to be an issue for the Postal Service to manage the burden?
Should I start and then Justin will pick up? So the answer is, yeah, it could be, absolutely. So particularly if we decide to do things like mail every registered voter a ballot, or mail everybody who's eligible an application, and then we have to process that application, and then we have to send them a ballot. So if you were to imagine a time where or I would say, let's try and imagine a worse time to talk about letting the Postal Service fail or not giving the Postal Service enough funding. So there's a number of different cogs in the machine that we really need to make sure that vote by mail works. And this is why Justin and I have been up, not since, this week, but since March, looking at this and saying, like, we have to ramp up. Elections in our country are very dispersed. This is not something that's run by the federal government. It's really run by the states and generally the counties. So you have to give, it's a little bit of a dance between the states and the counties. You have to give them time to just get all the infrastructure in place. One of those cogs, as you asked, is the Postal Service. So you need to think about things like stamps, like what you're going to do. Will you mail everybody a ballot that needs to be stamped? Will it include postage? Again, how many different pieces of paper are going to have to go up and back? We know in California, or I should say, I know best from my experience in California, that it's hard to get voters to send back a piece of mail. And sometimes you have to remind them. So now we're in another nightmare where we have to send a reminder card. Think about Super Tuesday, which feels like about 100,000 years ago in California, but was actually March 3rd, where if you were a no party preference voter like I am, you got a postcard that said, if you want to vote in the Democratic primary, you have to return this postcard. Very few people returned it because very few people were really thinking about Super Tuesday before sometime around, not so Super Monday. And so there's so many different parts of the machine that have to work well in order for vote by mail to be as effective as it could be. And as I said, the Postal Service is one of those parts. It's a key part because it literally is what would carry the ballot or the way you get the ballot to the people and then carry that ballot to its destination, unless you have somebody, for instance, picking up your ballot. And I assume we'll talk about ballot harvesting later as well.
Yeah. Since we were talking about the possibility of mailing ballots potentially to everybody, there is a question about should we clean up the voter rolls in advance to remove maybe people that we know have deceased or have been inactive for a certain period of time. Are there issues there that we should be thinking about in terms of who we do end up mailing to?
Yes, and yes. So Jessica mentioned the drop-off, the dramatic drop-off starting in March of voter registrations. That's not just new voter registrants. That's people updating or changing their voter registration. About 14% of America moves every year. And they don't necessarily move far, but that doesn't matter when you're trying to vote by mail. So if you're voting in a polling place, if you're voting at the polls and you've moved down the street or you've moved to a separate apartment or you've moved somewhere within the same county, it's often possible to sort of fix things, to update things right there at the polls. In fact, there's a federal law that gives you the right to vote, even if you've changed addresses, even if you haven't re-registered or updated your registration, as long as you can go to the polls to update in person on the day of. That doesn't work in an election where most of the ballots are going to be cast by mail. You can't update your address at the polls because you're not at the polls. And if the election entity doesn't have your right address on file, you're never going to get the materials, including your ballot or including your application. So it is really important to promote registration, to make sure that people check their registration, to make sure they're registered where they think they should be registered, to make sure that people who think that they're registered actually are registered. A lot of states, thankfully, in the last couple of years have made that easier. There are now online ways in a lot of states to check your registration or even to get registered if you're not already. But that has to be a major push, a major public education push, particularly this summer. It's the season of registration drives. We're now in Pride Month, and Pride parades all over the country used to be used to help register people. A little bit later in the summer, there'll be county fair season, and those used to be used to register people and get them updated. And with the pandemic, it's going to be much harder to keep that volume up, which means that people are going to be at risk of not getting the ballots that they should be. That's going to require a lot of public education to make sure that people know you should be checking early and often to make sure that you're registered in the right place.
Let's turn to some of the other challenges. We've mentioned some of the issues having to do with the back office of getting the paper printed, and you have to make decisions about whether you're going to globally send out or require invite everybody to apply to vote by mail. However that's going to be done, there's going to be a lot of back office effort on the part of registrars. What are some of the other challenges that if we are going to promote, if the society is going to promote voting by mail, what are some of the other challenges? And I'm thinking, like older people or people in, residential facilities that don't necessarily have easy access to various things. What are those challenges? And Jessica, maybe we can start with you, and then Jessica can follow up.
Yeah, I'll start because I have really broad ones. So I increasingly think, and it's partly based on that registration cliff drop off, that one of the biggest challenges to vote by mail is just telling people it's safe and you should do it. And that, in my perspective, is the whole point of this discussion about trying to cast doubt on the vote by mail system, trying to cast doubt on the integrity of our elections, is this idea of, if you say it over and over again, if you say there's something to be suspicious about, there's something you can't really trust about the vote by mail system, then it starts to become part of the public consciousness. And we've obviously seen this with more than just vote by mail. And it's just convincing people that it is something that they can feel safe taking part in, and that they should. And if you think about the fears, I mean, on the one hand, we have this alleged voter fraud fear. On the other hand, we have this very real fear of chilling votes. And I know I sound like a partisan, I'm actually not a partisan, but if you look at public statements by Republicans, what many have now kind of said explicitly is that they think they do better with depressed voter turnout. Now, I think that's a reason why we see in many red states, the states do things like restrict how easy it is to register to vote, how many early voting places there are, how many polling places there are in certain locations. And then on the other side, you have Democrats who clearly think that it benefits them to have higher turnout. So you see in a lot of blue states, the opposite, no voter ID, or I shouldn't say no voter ID, but much more lax voter ID, lots of early polling places, will send you your vote by mail, will send you an application if you're eligible. And the statistics don't necessarily kind of bear out that is true, that it's this very clean, Republicans will be worse off if there's high voter registration and Democrats will benefit, or vice versa. And we have to be really clear about the nuances here in terms of vote by mail could benefit certain party as opposed to others. So it's not just this clean, if more people come to the polls, that's better for Democrats. But so a bit more specific. So that's my biggest fear, is that people just won't participate. And this is a small part of that fear. When the three of us did the journalist law school last week, one of the journalists said to me, my grandmother's African-American. She lives in an assisted living facility, and she does not trust, very understandably based on a history of it being very difficult for her to vote. She doesn't trust anything other than her grabbing that ballot and with her own hand putting it in the drop box, or putting it. And so I really worry about that as well. So I worry about people just not participating, and I also worry about people who, for other reasons, don't trust the vote by mail system. Mm-hmm. And so my biggest fear is lack of participation.
Justin, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to lift up two things in particular that that Jessica pointed out, and then add one very quick other one. I think what you're seeing in media commentary is a lot of, exactly as Jessica said, assumptions about who benefits or who fails to benefit from particular rules. And those are people acting, I think, based on their assumptions about what happens in the normal election, talking about particular voters on the margins. This is not that election. And I think people's assumptions about who benefits or who loses based on changes in the electoral process are wildly out of whack with what happens with an election in a pandemic. It turns out that there is the very real possibility that if you restrict voting enough, you break the system as a whole, not just for some people, but for everybody. And if you're sitting on a plane and the plane goes down, it doesn't matter whether you're in first class or the middle seat of the last row, the plane's still going down. I think a lot of people are making assumptions about relative comfort and relative familiarity with the election process, not understanding that they could well break the entire thing in a pandemic, and that's going to have some very, very unpredictable consequences. So that's just lifting up. Jessica made this point. I just wanted to make that again. In terms of your other question about what is necessary beyond getting the ballots to people, and Jessica made this point too, the Postal Service, assuming that it is allowed to function as it's been functioning, can handle the volume. There's far more traffic that the Postal Service handles on Black Friday, now that it's delivering all of Amazon's packages, but also around the holidays, around Christmas, than in the election season, right? They are up to this challenge if people let them be. The problems are with us and with the election apparatus around the Postal Service. So registration, as Jessica mentioned, ballot counting machines, large devices that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in big cities that need space and room. And though California jurisdictions have had 50, 60% voting by mail in the past and are equipped to ramp up the volume, jurisdictions, particularly cities on the Eastern Seaboard, that have had single-digit participation in vote by mail, may not actually have the equipment yet they need to get significant capacity to process absentee ballots. On top of that, the counting structure. It's going to take longer to figure out who won when you've got a lot of absentee ballots.
Wait a moment. Wait. I'm there watching the news at 8 o'clock in California time, and all the East Coast numbers are coming in. So I know what's happening on the Eastern Seaboard because it's 3 hours later, and I'm not going to be able to do that.
You're not going to be able to rely on the anchors telling you they think they know what's going on because they see numbers coming in. So this is the important point. The statistical, and hopefully, the anchors know not to create a sense of panic that we don't have instant gratification. You know, we're all used to seeing the election countdown go down 3 minutes and 2 minutes and 1 minute and polls close, and guess what? X won. That's unlikely to happen this year, and hopefully the anchors know that enough not to freak out. That's based on, we never know the results of an election until the election's certified formally. That's the legal mechanism. Several weeks after the election. That's because we actually think we have to count ballots in order to figure out who won. The anchors make projections based on who's walking out of the polls and certain statistical models saying X percentage of people voted at the polls. We've talked to X percentage of people. We know how this vote is trending. We feel sufficiently confident that we can call the race for X or Y, or in some cases that we can't call the race. When there's a massive shift in the mode of election, when there's a big shift from voting in person to voting absentee, and you don't know what percentage of the total ballots your sample at the polls represents, or whether in fact they are a representative sample, the statistics get very strange very quickly, and they make predictions really inaccurate. And so what's likely to happen is 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, and a lot of talking heads charge on all of our parts.
Interesting. I do have a question that's kind of a logistical one. If we do have mail-in ballots, and the mail-in, started a month ago, haven't they already counted the ballots that were sent in? They don't start counting at 8 o'clock, do they? They can't. If 50% of the ballots have come in by the day before the election, aren't those counted in advance? They don't start, right?
It depends on the state.
Really?
So much else in the election process, it depends on the state. Some states have rules that say, even if we've gotten an absentee ballot, we have to make sure that you, John, didn't show up to vote in person. And so we have to wait to count your absentee ballot until we know that you didn't show up in person, that you haven't already submitted one. Mm-hmm. Other states count the absentee ballot and take you off of the rolls when you show up in person so that they don't have to worry about the later vote. But that totally depends on the rules and the infrastructure in each state.
I see. So there are several questions I'd like to bring in, and there will be other things that we can address as well. But Are we going to anticipate a lot of last minute litigation around all of these issues?
Yep.
Jessica, you want to field this one? That's an easy question.
The nod was enough. Yes. So Justin and I talked about this, I think, last week and the week before when we were discussing something else. And I mean, there are dozens of lawsuits. So for instance, I'll just call out one of them.
Already, you mean? Dozens
Yes.
Already.
Wait,
Go ahead.
Justin, did you nod no or yes?
I nodded dozens is substantially underselling. So I'm trying to track all of the election litigation that is only related to COVID, that is only related to the pandemic. And as of yesterday, I'm up to 117 cases in 36 states.
Yeah, so that's a yes. And so I'll just call out one of them. As we said, by executive order, Governor Newsom said we're going to send every registered voter, not every eligible voter, every registered voter, a vote by mail ballot. And the Republican National Committee and the California Republican Committee sued almost immediately. And the argument was essentially twofold. One is this will lead to an enormous amount of fraud. And that was really a kind of political argument in a legal brief. And then the second argument was more of a legal argument, which is just that Governor Newsom overstepped his authority. That if you look at how elections are structured and how the power of to change election rules are structured, this is something that would reside within the state, and that we don't have enough of an emergency now, essentially, for Governor Newsom to say, yes, send them, that you need to go through the legislative process. That, in that particular suit, I think the most recent ruling as of, it's hard to remember days, but about 2 days ago, was that we're going to temporarily push pause on that executive order until we have a hearing, I think on June 24th or June 26th. And, but that's just one example of the, as Justin's been tracking, you know, a lot of litigation that is going to be surrounding the election with respect to COVID.
And at least one good factor about literally hundreds of cases right now is the hope is that there are some very tricky legal rules involved. These cases are all on rocket dockets. They're all getting resolved. You know, normal civil litigation timeline can be years, and these are resolved in sometimes days, usually weeks, every once in a while months. The hope is they can be resolved long enough before November to actually make the rules clearer for November. So if anything, it's hard to call anything in June of an election year early. But if anything, the mass of litigation in response to the primary I think is a positive for November.
So you like the idea that there's a lot of litigation now because of the getting things resolved earlier rather than last minute. That's
judges
an optimistic way of looking at it, I guess.
It like lawyers, like perhaps law students, judges don't do their best work with a 24-hour deadline. And so I want them considering the ramifications of unprecedented burdens and how, if at all, the election structure should shift, or whether they have a responsibility to shift, even independent of what legislatures and executives do, whether the courts have a responsibility to shift the election structure. I want them, nobody's got the luxury of time right now, but I'd rather give them more than a couple hours to make these decisions. And so, yeah, I think now is a better alternative than October.
So let's just get into a couple of things outside of California, because at least in California, from what you're saying, it sounds like the registrars, the counties, at the state level, people are very focused on the election and are trying to figure stuff out at this point. What about other states? Randomly, Texas, New Mexico, New Hampshire, Iowa, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin. Are these states, I'm sure everybody's thinking about it at some level, but are they actually moving ahead on these federal questions? These are federal elections that are coming up very quickly. Do you have a sense of what's going on elsewhere?
Yeah, I'll let Justin go ahead. I'll just say I think every state knows it's time. Some states obviously want to do something about it. So the first threshold is political will, and then I'll let I'll let Justin talk about what's actually happening.
Well, that's exactly right. The real question is who has the will to do what? There are different actors in the states, so the states aren't uniform either. You've got legislatures that were dead set against what executives were doing, and vice versa. You've got some that are working in concert together. You've also got state level actors sometimes supporting and sometimes undermining local actors. So most of our elections are actually administered on the ground by counties, and in New England and the upper Midwest by towns. It's very decentralized. And they operate alongside some state rules, but with an awful lot of local discretion. And that means, are they getting ready? Depends entirely on who the they are. There are legislatures considering changes, some good, some bad. There are executives, as Jessica mentioned, here in California that are issuing orders, again, some good, some bad. There are local officials that are trying really hard to make the elections run, really hard to make the elections work, sometimes with the support of their state bodies and sometimes being undermined by the state bodies. There's no shortage of activity. Is it working? Not yet. Will it work by November? There are an awful lot of people trying to make sure that it does. But you don't have to look back very far. The Wisconsin primary in March and the Georgia primary, just a few days ago, were both appalling examples with one mix under preparation, one part massive underfunding, one part pandemic circumstance. You can't make people show up to be poll workers if they feel afraid and they don't want to show up. And every once in a while, one part, again, I think mistaken projection about whether the status quo benefits them politically in a sheer election calculation, then changing the rules. And that's a pretty inconsistent brew, depending on what local jurisdiction you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So there have been proposals afoot, and this is a federal election. Let's just put aside local, sometimes local elections and statewide elections take place at the same time for state officials and local officials. But let's just deal with the congressional race, the Senate, the presidential race, and so forth. And there have been proposals, given the pandemic and the likelihood of a second spike, and everybody's going to be terrorized to go anywhere near a polling place. There have been proposals, we should postpone the election. Can we do that? Can we maybe postpone until we have a vaccine? Postpone to January, let's say, hypothetically.
Nope. So,
why not?
I know.
I'm not proposing. I'm devilishly advocating.
You're the advocate for the audience. I understand. Justin and I will answer this one together. I mean, the answer is no. So the date is set by Congress, and then there's an inauguration. And it's pretty clear that the president can only serve 2 four-year terms. And there's a mechanism in place if there's a problem with the presidential election, but there is not a mechanism, let's be very clear, for the president by executive order, for instance, to say, looks pretty scary out there, maybe we should wait a while.
Yeah, okay. I'll agree with that. The president can't do anything on his own. Congress could, if it wished, move the election by a week or so. But A, it won't, because B, it won't do any good. That extra week runs right up until things like certification deadlines in the states, runs right into the electoral college voting, runs, as Jessica said, into inauguration, which is constitutionally set. And so, no, the hardest deadline we've got is likely to be the deadline that sticks, at least for federal elections, which is first Tuesday after first Monday in November.
So given that we're going to have an election in November on the scheduled date, and we've had some experiences recently with some states, the most recent being Georgia, and we can even go back to the Iowa primary, where there were a lot of disputations around what happened there. What can we identify lessons? Are there things that can be done before November and should be? What are those kinds of things? And like what happened in Georgia that should be terrorize every voting election expert in the country and maybe put the fire to the people who can do something about it. So what did we learn?
Justin, I keep going first, so let's change it up if that works.
Excellent. I'll go first, and then I'll let Jessica correct me in everything I say. So one thing that we can and should do is to increase registration capacity. We've talked about that, right? To make sure that people are registered and on the rolls in the right place. That takes massive amounts of public education now, continuing for the next 3 months. Another thing we should do is encourage as much voting by mail as possible. That means getting people the information they need to either apply or simply receive an absentee ballot if they're registered in the right place. And it means ensuring capacity of the jurisdictions to receive all of this incoming, both applications and absentee ballots. Again, the jurisdictions that are already at 50 or 60% vote by mail have a better chance of getting to 90 than the jurisdictions at 6 have a chance of getting to 50, but they're going to need a lot of help. That's still going to leave, notice I didn't say 100% anywhere, that's still going to leave some amount of people who will need in-person voting. The communities that are hard to mail, the communities that need assistance, the communities of people with disabilities, of people with language access issues. There are, and people, as Jessica mentioned, there are strong cultural norms in some places about voting in person. We won't, I fear, be able to serve all of them, all of the people who want to vote in person, simply because the pandemic limits personnel and locations. We're going to have fewer places available with fewer people to staff them in a pandemic. And that's going to mean 5, 6, 7, 8 hour lines like we saw in some of the primaries already. So shift as many people as you can to the absentee structure while still maintaining as robust an in-person presence as possible. And the single best thing that local jurisdictions can do for that is prep. This is not, and I want to emphasize, some aspects of what we've just discussed are hindered by sort of what you might call voter suppression legislation or policies at the state level. But the vast majority of it isn't actively active suppression. It's a failure to, or inability to, prepare locally. It's not being imposed on by the states. It's the fact that we do elections on the cheap. Mm-hmm. We don't actually pay for very robust elections. And in a lot of respect, we get what we pay for. And that means that a lot of election offices are trying to administer these elections on a shoestring. I know LA County, by the way, the 10th biggest state if it were a state. So a local jurisdiction in name only is doing and has been doing all of these things. They started as soon as the pandemic hit. The registrar in LA County has started trying to make sure we can shift as many people to absentee ballots as possible, and that we try to establish in-person locations and the staffing to deal with it. But even for somebody as committed as the LA County registrar is to making sure that everybody who's eligible and wants to vote can, it's hard. It's really hard. And so it's a little bit of an all hands on deck moment. And I'll turn this over to Jessica in a second to take us out. But I often talk about normal work that we do in the voting sphere, particularly voter protection work, as finding enough duct tape to cover the cracks in the bucket. That's the normal election. This election, we're trying to find enough duct tape to make a bucket. That is, we need to have enough duct tape on hand to hold the water even when there is no bucket. It's that sort of all hands situation. And that is, that's going to take a lot of work by a lot of people.
Did you want to add to that, Jessica?
No, not when we end with duct tape. And no, that's perfect. And I'll just thank Justin for bringing up two of my least favorite things, which is the idea of drowning and dying in a plane accident. So thank you. This has been enormously uplifting.
I'm not voting from home, but a garbage truck is just going by here. I don't know if it's being picked up. It's like every time I get online, a garbage truck goes by. Are we ending at 10 before the hour, Justin, or do we go right to the hour?
I think we can start releasing people. We sort of promised people it would be roughly till 10:45, 10:50, but we can still going for those members of the audience that still want to stick with us for another 10 minutes. If the rest of us are able to stick around, we can stick around. But we can certainly release people who have other 1 o'clock calls or otherwise things to do.
Well, for those people who will be exiting shortly, I just want to thank Justin Levitt, Professor of Law at Loyola, and Jessica Levinson, also a professor at Loyola, for your expertise. But if you two are still available for a few more minutes, let me pull in a couple of more questions. The question of a contested election, I think, is on a lot of people's minds. And if you were able to clarify all of these rules and get them all figured out in advance, get enough resources to the people who need the resources to run an efficient election, it still seems a pretty strong possibility of a contested election. And so is it going to come down to the Supreme Court once again? The Supreme Courts of the 50 states? Do you have a prediction about that?
Okay, so I'll start very briefly. Everybody's least favorite answer, right? It depends. So you probably saw me like physically kind of curl in when you said contested election, because it's definitely one of the things that we're not particularly excited about. So as you alluded to when you said, U.S. Supreme Court or state Supreme Court, there could be a number of different reasons that we contest an election. So there are so many different election laws and administrative procedures that could be questioned. And so I don't mean to be kind of hedging and saying, well, there's no way to answer this other than there are so many different possibilities where you could say that a certain practice or something that happened on election day violated the federal constitution, or you could say, in a different situation that there was a problem with respect to the state constitution. I as much as it was, terrifically exciting as a college student to be listening into Bush v. Gore, I truly hope that we do not see that happen again. And I would say, I think that there's one person who hopes much more than I do, well, Justin and I together, but who hopes that we will not see a contested election that goes to the Supreme Court, and that's Chief Justice John Roberts. I think that he's enormously excited to avoid having to essentially look like he's deciding the election. And if you look at how overjoyed he appeared to be during the impeachment process, and if you look just yesterday at what the Supreme Court is accepting for cert and what they're deciding basically deciding not to decide, I think that this court is motivated to try and, as much as possible, stay out of the current political fray.
Anything to add there, Justin?
Just that it depends a little bit on what you mean by contested. So there will be lots of states, again, where we're not going to know who won on election night. Mm-hmm. And the best thing that we can do collectively is to get comfortable with that. That does not mean the process is broken. That means the process is working. And if we can all manage to avoid the collective freak out when the countdown timer hits 0 and we don't have an immediate
I think you're cutting out, Justin.
That actually solidifies us and stabilizes us for a internet connection. Can you all hear me?
Now we can. You were out for about 20 seconds. So let's rewind for 20 seconds.
So the 20 seconds is the more that we can get comfortable with the idea that it's not broken if we don't know who won the minute the polls close, the better we'll be able to be, the more stable we'll be, and the more resilient we'll be in the face of calls that the election is contested. That is,
we're going to need social media. We're going to need social media.
We're going to need to exercise some patience muscles that we haven't used in a very long time, right? There will be a claim that candidates have won the election or lost the election as soon as the polls close. And if we can steel ourselves to wait from the real answer from the professionals who are actually counting the vote, that lets the process work as it does. And I don't call that a contested election. I call that the normal process for all, this is for law school alums and students. Grading takes a minute. And you're not always going to know exactly what your grade is the minute you finish the final. If you can hold out to let the grading process actually work, that's not a contested election. The contested election is a lawsuit afterward, where we have a real dispute once we've counted the ballots about which ballot should count and by how much. The election administrator's prayer is always, dear Lord, let this not be close. And so if it's close in a few states, we could well see state litigation. We could well see Supreme Court litigation. I think Jessica's absolutely right. The Supreme Court would love to stay out of this entirely. But I want to suggest that we can inoculate ourselves, and in a time of pandemic, that seems particularly appropriate, against premature calls that the election's been contested by not jumping to conclusions about the answer about who won.
So one last question, and then I think we'll bring this to closure. And that is Congress working to get money into the hands of state or local officials? Is that, where are we in that process? Is that going to happen?
So I can tell you where we are, and then Jessica can tell you whether it's going to happen or not. There is a bill. So Congress did already put about $400 million into the hands of election officials earlier this year. That's what we call a nice start. So that's an appetizer. That's a amuse-bouche. That is enough to get elections a little bit along the way in many jurisdictions, but not enough to make them reliable throughout. There is a $4 billion bill that I think got through the House that is a whole lot closer to what the jurisdictions are gonna need. But as for the prospects of that, I don't know. Congress has moved pretty quickly on a bunch of things in March and then slowed down fairly dramatically.
Yeah.
Do you have an answer to the question?
Oh, absolutely not. Although I'm really excited that we could finally say amuse-bouche during this panel because I was waiting for that. But
given that it's lunchtime.
Yeah, I don't know. It does feel like that there was a lot of momentum and then it kind of dissipated. And, for very understandable reasons. So now we're talking about things like qualified immunity. Now we're talking about things like protesters' rights and defunding the police. And so there's only so many things that we can collectively stay hyper-focused on for so long. And it typically, I'm glad that we're talking about it, even though I think it feels late for us, it feels early for a lot of people. So my suspicion is that there will be some funding and some additional funding and that it won't be adequate.
I just want to make one point, just following up on that, because it's a really good point. Policing is an infrastructure issue. You notice it when it breaks, and it has broken far too often for far too many people and not equitably. And people are starting to realize how broken it is in some places, not everywhere, but in a lot of places, a lot more broken than it should be. Elections are the infrastructure of infrastructure. They're the infrastructure that underlies absolutely everything else. And that's not news to anybody who's in LA County, where there is an extremely hotly contested district attorney race that directly links the election process to the criminal justice process. There are elected county DAs and elected mayors that control police chiefs in jurisdictions all over the country. And although Jessica is absolutely right that attention has shifted in Congress to the criminal justice system, and appropriately so, getting the elections right is a precursor to making sure that that criminal justice system is actually responsive to us. And so it can't be either or. Actually, the right answer to get either one done is a both and.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that, we'll bring the session to a close. I want to thank both of you again, Justin Levitt, Professor of Law at Loyola, and Jessica Levinson, Professor of Law at Loyola Law School, and I am John Nockleby. Ditto for me. I want to put in a plug for Thursday's program, where I will make another appearance, this time as a panelist. We'll be talking about potential immunities, good faith and otherwise, in a variety of contexts. So I look forward to seeing some of you on Thursday. And once again, thank you, Justin, and thank you, Jessica.
Thank you,
Thanks,
John.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody.